welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, how Mathieu van der Poel won Milano-Sanremo. I'll be over on the touchscreen analysing where he got it right and others got it wrong. I'll also be looking back at a bunch of one-day races in Belgium, France and Italy, as well as letting you know about the huge amount of racing you can look forward to watching this week. This week in the world of racing, we learned that Shirin van Androoy is far too fast for motorbikes.
Shirin van Androoy of Trek Segafredo just waving that bike out the way. The police bike just needs to get out of the way here of Shirin van Androoy here. Oh, van Androoy just having to just brake back, shakes the head.
Despite the motorbikes impeding her, van Androoy went on to take her first ever win on the road. More on that later on. We also learned that it was not a good week for Stan de Wolf. Here he is crashing into a pile of steaming manure at the Grand Prix de Dinan, or indeed the same day for Hugo Hofstetter, who crashed twice there. The first time he broke his bars, got a spare bike, crashed again, and then broke the bars on his spare bike as well. And finally, we learned that Mathieu van der Poel's lack of form at Tirreno Adriatico was either turned around very quickly indeed, or it was a bluff. Here's his race-winning move from Milano-Sanremo on Saturday.
Now it's Van der Poel who makes his move. Van Aert is the one struggling. Pogačar's trying to respond.
You could spend hours analysing every single edition of Milano-Sanremo and the individual stories of the riders that took part in the race, but I'm going to focus on the lead into and up the Poggio and the four key players from the race. So this first clip is from that lead into the Poggio. We've got a couple of Ks to go at this point. And you can see that Bahrain Victorious have done incredibly well. They've got a total of 6 riders over the top of the Cipressa in the front group, more than any other team. And at this point, they've still got 4 around last year's winner, Tadej Pogačar. Of the 4 riders who ended up animating the race, they're all in a decent position at this point. Van Aert, though, wasn't before this clip and had to do a lot of work to get here. On his wheel, we have Mathieu van der Poel, and over on this side, with a teammate in front of him, is Tadej Pogačar. Best placed of all of the favourites in the end, though, Filippo Ganna here of the Ineos Grenadiers. What I want you to look out for, though, is this look from Søren Kragh Andersen, new recruit to Alpecin-Deceuninck. I think he's looking around trying to see where Van der Poel is to make sure that he can do his best job going into the climb. But he looks twice over to the left and then swings to the left. What that does is pushes Van Aert into the wind. It's another little effort that their rival has to make before the start of the climb. Then, if we go into the climb itself, Bahrain Victorious are still leading. Fred Wright's done his job, he swings off. Andrea Pasqualon starts to do his. Now, this is where I think they made a slight mistake. Don't get me wrong, they did absolutely brilliantly to get this many riders to this point in the race and to lead Tadej Pogačar into the Poggio. However, I feel like they got a little bit overexcited. Pasqualon goes at warp speed, and that's not necessarily what Tadej Pogačar needs. It's perfect for Pogačar because he's not using his own teammates at this point, but rather those of Bahrain Victorious. I think they could have gone 1 or 2 kilometres per hour slower to give Pogačar a better chance. At this point, you can see that Pogačar is having to move himself up from a little bit further back. He's got 2 teammates in front of him. Van Aert is up here, and Van der Poel not far behind him here. Next clip then is this one, and you can see Tadej Pogačar wants to move up onto the wheel of Tim Wellens. It's still Bahrain Victorious on the front, but you can see the main players already beginning to make their move. Filippo Ganna there on the left-hand side too, starting to go up, and you can see that he's got very good legs indeed. The next clip is a little bit further up the climb. It's this one, and again, I just wanted to point out the role that Søren Kragh Andersen played for Van der Poel on the day. In a post-race interview, we found out that Van der Poel knew by this point he had very good legs, and he'd communicated that to the rest of the team. But the Dane here was constantly looking around, looking over his shoulder, not just for Van der Poel, but to predict anything that might happen. And when this happened, Tim Wellens launching an attack, or at least launching Pogačar to try and get him up the road, Søren Kragh was very quick to respond and make sure that Van der Poel was in the best possible position. Here we go then. At this point, we've still got Tim Wellens on the front. I've got to say he did a fantastic job for Pogačar on the day. But another teammate at UAE, Matteo Trentin, has let the wheel go. Now, during commentary, I couldn't decide whether it was because he couldn't hold the wheel anymore or whether he deliberately lost the wheel to try and aid his teammates. Having looked back at the Strava file and where they are on the climb, I think it's the latter because this is a flatter section of the course. However, all of these riders behind him, by the time they realise a gap's opened up, none of them want to be the ones to close it because the speed is in excess of 40 kilometres per hour here. If you do the closing of the gap, you are going to pay for it later. Right, this is the point where Pogačar launches his attack, and would you guess it? I wouldn't have done. It's Filippo Ganna who's the first rider to respond and get straight onto the wheel. Kraujansen's done his job. Van Aert has already been gapped slightly, but glued to his wheel is Mathieu van der Poel. So at this point, we can start to see that Van Aert is not quite on the form that he would have hoped to have on the day. He did eventually close the gap, of course, but in doing so, he allowed Mathieu van der Poel to save a fair bit of energy because he just stuck on the wheel. Right then. On to the next clip, which is what we saw of Van der Poel's attack. Now, we didn't see it actually made because the camera was on a different rider at the time, but this is in slow motion and you can see he immediately gets a huge gap on the rest. Pogačar has already done a lot in the wind at this point. He did everything he could to try and distance everybody else. He carried on the front. So he's done the most work of everybody by this point. Van der Poel's been extremely clever. Never put his nose in the wind. Saved all of his matches for this one big attack towards the top of the climb. And again, Van Aert, he's there, but he's not right on the wheel. He's not on his best form. What this means is that because they're very close to the top of the climb, Van der Poel already has more speed going into the descent than those who bind him. Right, move on to this side now, because I want to highlight the difference in descending between Wout van Aert and Filippo Ganna. If you watch Van Aert, he's going to go right down here and then cut in and have a nice line out. If you look at Ganna, he starts to come in early and ends up out here and loses quite a few bike lengths on the Belgian rider from Jumbo-Visma in front of him. There you can see it. Look at the distance on the exit between Van Aert and Ganna. And he had to do that on a few corners on the descent, and I think that took a lot out of him for that final 2 kilometres of flat road in towards the finish line. Incidentally, gap at the top of the climb for Van der Poel was 3 seconds. A little bit further down, it had eked out to 5 seconds. It wasn't the same crazy, risky descent that Matej Mohoric made last year, but he was solid. Now, the other thing I wanted to highlight was the impact, or lack of the race motorbikes this year. We didn't get those same shots, and I'm going to mention this later on, close up of Van der Poel on the descent, but it did make it for a fairer race. Look at the gap between Van der Poel and these 4 motorbikes up here. Last year and in previous years, you would have always seen them much closer to the front of the race, giving a real benefit in terms of drafting to the rider behind. But it was nice from my perspective to see that on the day. In the end then, a comfortable victory for Mathieu van der Poel, 15 seconds in front of Filippo Ganna in second, over 6 decades after his grandfather Raymond Poulidor won the same race, his only monument win. Looking at the times up the ascent of the Poggio is really interesting though. It was aggressive, we knew it was a tailwind for the most part, and Mathieu van der Poel is now the record holder for the Poggio ascent. Now, he hasn't uploaded to Strava, and that means that Van Aert and Pogačar are the current KOM up the Poggio, but climbing-records.com always times the best riders from the foot of the Poggio to the top. He has now beaten a record that was from 1995. Laurent Jalabert and Maurizio Fondriest. It stood for so long, but Van der Poel went up that climb at close to 40 kilometres per hour. Now, I know it's only a 3.9% gradient, but close to 40 kilometres per hour average with all those corners that they had to brake for as well. Absolutely unbelievable. So, what other takeaways were there from Milan-Sanremo? Well, firstly, I wanted to highlight the sheer consistency of Van der Poel, Pogačar and Van Aert in the monuments. Between them, they've now ridden 35, and only 5 times have any of them finished outside the top 10. The last time that happened was at this very race in August 2020, and since then, they've never been outside the top 10 in a monument that they started. Between them, they've won 7, 3 apiece for Van der Poel and Pogačar, just the 1 so far for Van Aert. In all of those 35 monument participations, there hasn't been a single DNF between the 3 of them, and the worst result for any of them was a 22nd place for Van Aert at the 2019 Paris-Roubaix. Now, the other big takeaway is that Filippo Ganna can win a monument. I've got to say, I had my doubts ahead of Saturday's race, but the way he rode up the Poggio and the way he sprinted at the finish, he's surely got a chance at this race and Paris-Roubaix in the future. And Italy really needs that hope, especially at their home race. Without Pidcock, Ganna already had a bit more pressure on his shoulders last Saturday, but with that result, there will be even more this time next year. It was another one-day race to forget, unfortunately, for Soudal Quick-Step. Team leader Julian Alaphilippe crashed on the Ticino Pass, and the weird thing there was that Yves Lampaert, who hit the deck at the very same time, didn't wait up for him. He just got back on his bike and got to the peloton as quickly as possible. And it meant Alaphilippe had to get back to it all on his own. And whilst most of that was on descent, it would surely have taken a little bit out of him. He started the Poggio a little bit out of position, but in the end, he would finish the best placed of any of the Soudal Quick-Step riders in 11th. Now, I had a look this morning to see the last time that Soudal Quick-Step didn't have a rider in the top 10 at MSR, but actually, it's the third time in a row that they haven't had a rider in the top 10 of that race. Peter Sagan, meanwhile, finished 44th on a day, which means that he will finish his career without ever winning Milano-Sanremo. 12 years ago, the question we were all asking ourselves was how many editions he'd win. It seemed inconceivable with his qualities as a bike rider that he'd never add it to his palmarès. It's a real shame, but he's certainly animated the race over the years though, and for that we thank him. And finally, with MSR, I think we should tip our hats to RCS for making sure that the motorbikes did not interfere with the race this year. It meant that we didn't have those close-up shots of Van der Poel's attack or his descent down the other side, but it did mean that we had a much fairer race. Van der Poel didn't benefit from the draft of motorbikes during and after his attack, as other riders have done previously, and the motorbikes at the end of the descent did seem a little further in front of him than they have been in front of the front rider in the past. That said, RCS do need to up their sofa game. This one backstage at the finish was a little bit small for three big classics riders, and Wout really doesn't look impressed with it, does he? Right, on to the other one-day races that were on last week, and I'm going to start with yesterday's Trofeo Alfredo Binda. It was the next round of the UCI Women's World Tour. Now, it felt like quite an open race without the likes of Kopecky, Van Vleuten or Longo Borghini on the start line. But the big aim for a lot of the teams that were on the start line was to distance Lorena Wiebes before the finish. The European champion and current World Tour standings leader was racing the event for the very first time. And I've got to say, looking really strong on the climbs for a pure sprinter. What turned out to be the race-winning move came with just under 25 kilometres remaining. Gaia Realini had been drilling it on the front for Trek Segafredo, and just as they caught the breakaway of three riders, Shirin van Androoy went on the move, instructing the motorbike to get out of the way as she did so. Now, it's such an impressive display. For the next 10 kilometres, she never really had more than 15 seconds of an advantage over the chasing group, and she managed to hold that steady on the next climb of the day, despite all the attacks that were coming behind her. And it was on that climb that Wiebes finally got into difficulty, which basically spelt the end of SD Works' chances for that stage. Van Androoy's lead was still only 15 seconds as they started the final climb of the day, but there she managed to increase that advantage. Just when you thought she might start to fade and pay for her efforts, she went even faster. And that was the end of that. Despite being held up by a police motorbike, Van Androoy cruised to a comfortable victory, the first for her on the road. And to make it even better for the team that day, teammate Elisa Balsamo crossed the line in second place, just ahead of Vittoria Guazzini of FDJ Suez in third. Incidentally, it was also just the second day of racing on the road for Van Androoy this year. Definitely one to watch for the cobbled classics to come. This week's GCN Rider of the Week, though, is Van Androoy. What a ride she did yesterday. A few days earlier at Nokere Koerse, there was an equally impressive ride from Lotte Kopecky. The former Belgian champion had been attacking left, right and centre throughout the day, but the one that stuck came with just under 12 kilometres to go. Initially, she did have a couple of other riders with her, but yet another attack 6Ks later saw her go solo. With the form and determination she had on that day, absolutely nobody was going to catch her. She'd end up winning by almost half a minute from her teammate Lorena Wiebes in second. Now, she had been third, fourth and second over the last three editions of the race, but now she's finally taken that win. And what made that win even more incredible was that her elder brother had passed away just the week before. "Today I raced with two," she said in her post-race interview. Now, sincere condolences to you and to your family, Lotte. We also need to say a big get well soon to Loretta Hansen of Trek Segafredo, one of the many riders who crashed during that race. On the team's press release on their website, they said that she has sustained multiple rib fractures, a fracture of the left collarbone, as well as a fracture of the left transverse process of T1, which sounds awful, but hopefully she'll be back before too long. In the men's race, it was a 5th win of the year for Tim Merlier. He's currently making a very good case to be the Soudal Quick-Step team leader in terms of the sprints for the Tour de France. Incidentally, in all 76 editions of the race, he is the only current Belgian champion ever to win it. Just before I go through the other racing from last week, I am absolutely desperate to let you know what we've got coming up for you on GCN Plus this week. I have a lot to tell you about in terms of racing. First up, the men's World Tour stage racing resumes today with the Vuelta a Catalunya. That one is available to watch if you're in Europe, the US, the Middle East and North Africa, plus the Asia Pacific, excluding China, Japan and New Zealand. Now, it's going to be the first matchup between Primož Roglič and Remco Evenepoel since last year's Vuelta, and a prelude to what's to come in May at the Giro d'Italia. Now, Evenepoel has recently been at altitude training in Tenerife and broke the Strava KOM on Mount Teide, so he appears to be on relatively good form still since the UAE Tour. And we also saw, of course, that Roglič was going all right at Tirreno Adriatico. Geraint Thomas and Egan Bernal will make their European season debuts at the race as well, whilst Almeida and Adam Yates are back together for UAE. Richard Carapaz is also using it as his first stage race of the season, whilst teammate Rigoberto Urán uses it as his first race of the season so far, full stop. Other GC riders to watch out for include Landa, Ciccone, Bardet, O'Connor, Haig and Uterbrooks. Now, in terms of sprinters, well, as ever, there aren't really many opportunities for them and therefore not many sprinters at the start. Coquard, Hofstetter and Groves are the ones of note. Things are also hotting up in Belgium with a trio of one-day races coming up for you this week. Brugge de Panne on Wednesday for the men, Thursday for the women, whilst on Friday we have the mini Tour of Flanders that is the E3 Saxo Bank Classic. I'm actually going to be there at that race on a stag do that I've organised, so I'll wave to the cameras if I see them. Always one of my favourite races of the year though, because it uses most of the famous climbs and cobbled sectors that will feature at De Ronde just over a week later. And looking at the provisional start list, it seems that all the main favourites for the big one are going to be at E3 this Friday, including Van Aert, Van der Poel and Pogačar. Now, talking of De Ronde, we have made a special T-shirt to celebrate the second monument of the season, and it's available to buy now over at shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com. So if you'd like to make a purchase, please head over there. The Belgian races that I've been mentioning so far are available in all GCN Plus territories, incidentally, but there are some restrictions on Ghent-Wevelgem this Sunday, so check if it's available where you are. At close to 250 kilometres, Ghent-Wevelgem is not far short of monument distance and normally attracts many of the top classics riders, as I'm sure it will do again this year. In other news, if you're watching this, then you're probably a fan of bike racing, so we've got some very exciting news for you. Our sister channel GMBN will be bringing you even more racing coverage this year with the launch of a brand new channel, GMBN Racing. You'll be able to watch familiar faces such as Tom Pidcock, Mathieu van der Poel and Pauline Ferrand-Prévot take on the cross-country mountain bike calendar. We'll also have downhill racing, enduro racing, e-bike racing and much more over on that new channel. We're also going to be putting up highlights and previews of the major races, plus behind-the-scenes content from all of the biggest mountain bike races of the year.
Welcome to GMBN Racing.
We are hugely excited to be launching this channel dedicated to bike racing. So if you're a mountain bike race fan, then this is the place for you. All the action from the biggest mountain bike races of the year.
The UCI Mountain Bike World Series.
Cross country.
Downhill.
Enduro.
Enduro E.
Plus more from the world of mountain biking.
Race previews,
Behind the scenes,
interviews,
bike checks,
pit checks.
track walks.
Great stuff. Don't forget to head over to the GMBN Racing channel and hit the subscribe button. And also a reminder that you'll be able to watch all of the UCI World Cup racing this year on GCN Plus, making it even better value for money, even if I do say so myself. Now, on top of all of that, I can also now reveal that you'll be able to watch the brand new National Cycling League exclusively on GCN Plus this year. The first round is scheduled for the 8th of April. Now, the criterium scene in the US has been going from strength to strength in recent years, and that continues with the addition of this brand new series. The NCL will commence in 2023 initially with 4 rounds in very prime locations. So we've got Miami first, then Atlanta, Denver and Washington. At each round, there will be multiple teams competing with an even split between male and female riders. And it all starts with the Miami Beach Invitational on the 8th of April. Now, I think we can be guaranteed of some serious action in these races, in part because the NCL has the largest prize pot ever seen in criterium racing. Now, for traditional road racing fans, there is absolutely no doubt it will be a departure from the norm, but I think that's what's going to be very exciting about it. I cannot wait to see what it's all about. Meanwhile, our documentary this week is the latest in our Legends series. I had the privilege of heading to Monaco to visit Philippe Gilbert, recently retired and now working for us on GCN Plus and Eurosport. Here's a sneak peek.
A 20-year career.
Philippe Gilbert is going to show the youngsters how this is done.
4 out of the 5 monuments.
Gilbert's going to do it!
An Ardennes Classics clean sweep. World champion.
Here comes Gilbert. Gilbert is going for a long way out.
If you name it, Philippe Gilbert has probably won it.
That full documentary is available to watch on GCN Plus from tomorrow, Tuesday. Right, a quick wrap up from the other races of last week. Juan Sebastian Milano won the Grand Prix d'Hénin from a small group on Wednesday. He got the better of Tim van Dijk in the sprint to the line there. He then tried to return the favour to teammate Pascal Ackermann the following day at the Bredene Kokzijde Classic, but unfortunately the German was pipped to the line by very fast finishing Gerben Thijssen, who took his second win of the year and his first clear win. At the Cholet Pays de la Loire yesterday, Groupama FDJ rode an absolute blinder. Some great work there from Louis Askey. Perfectly set up 20-year-old Lawrence Pithy to take his first ever pro win. Incidentally, the New Zealander had finished second to Alex Zinglet of Cofidis the previous day at the Classic Loire Atlantique. And finally, Milano-Torino. There was a huge win there for the Tudor Pro cycling team. They took complete control of the race on the run into the line, finishing it off with Arvid de Klein. Now, there were some complaints from second-place finisher Fernando Gaviria, and although the result remained, he did have a bit of a point. De Klein was up against the barriers initially for his sprint, but then he opened the door before closing it again. Either way, a really great result for such a new team, especially at such a big race. Right then, that is all for this week's Racing News Show, but I do hope you enjoy all of the racing we've got for you on GCN Plus this week. I know I certainly will be. You will be in the capable hands of Joe Timms this time next week, but I'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time reviewing the Tour of Flanders. Can't wait. But goodbye for now.